Stiffer suspension forks are better, right? We're going to dig into the details of how different diameter forks can make a difference to your ride, with a comparison between a Fox 34 and a Fox 36. There's much hype about fork diameter, and one diameter, bigger or smaller, is going to make a better fork. But do we all need a stiffer fork chassis? As with many things mountain bike, there's myths, there's marketing doublespeak, and then there's, well, the actual trail feel. We're going to cut through the crap and tell you all you need to know about the difference in diameters. We're going to take two forks and ride them, and we'll be able to feel all the differences. Well, maybe not, because ride feel is really subjective and it depends on the rider and the inputs that they give in and the trail that you're riding. Okay, we can minimise some of the trail differences by riding the same trail, but we're also going to do some, well, just experiments to see how they work under braking. So a sort of static load to see what they're like. We're also going to do a steering test to see, again, what differences there might be. Yeah, we're going to ride it on single track and we're going to ride it through rock gardens, just to see if the data of the differences that we can test matches up to a different ride experience. So, fork stiffness. To be very clear, we're not talking about how we set the fork up with spring rate, be that air pressure or a different coil. We've done a whole video on how to set sag and how to do it properly. No, we're talking about chassis and fork structure stiffness. What do I mean by fork chassis and what do I mean by fork structure? I'll explain. Here's a brief anatomy of a fork. Okay, starting from the top, we've got the steerer. The stem is clamped to it and it runs through the headset and then comes down into the crown. It's a press fit, but it's not like a press fit in other parts. There's like 5 tons of pressure or more that inserts the steerer into this section. This is the crown. And this will be different between different forks because the legs here, or the stanchions, again, push fit or press fit into that assembly. So, down the legs, and then we've got the lower leg assembly, or the lower leg. And in this, well, that's where the magic happens. In one side there'll be a spring, and the other side there'll be a damper, most commonly, whether that be a air spring or a coil spring. And the damping unit can be different too. You can get cartridges, you can get bladder systems, you can get open bath as well. But effectively we've got a spring one side and a damper the other. And as we come down to the bottom of the fork, well, there's something quite important, and that's the QR and axle assembly. With this, we've got a bolt-through design, so it is stiffer than the old-school QRs. Under braking, the fork is under a different load. It's longitudinal, so it's sort of in the direction of travel. The contact point, the bottom of the tyre, is in contact with the ground. It gets loads of traction from the disc brake being applied, and all of that force then loads into the fork from where the brake is. That's going to put some torsion, depending on where the bushings is, into the fork lower, and then as that load increases, as the traction stays before the traction breaks away, well, we'll probably see some flex from the crown up here. We're going to do a comparison between the 34 and the 36 just to visualise the difference in flex. The other force that's affecting our fork is rotational. This is where we're loading and turning. Obviously, how a bike turns is much more complex than a car. It's not simply turning a wheel and the wheel's turning flat. No, there's lots more dynamic movements into a turn on a bike. But just as an indicative sort of loading, if we turn the bars like this, you can see how much flex there is within the system. Some of that's from the contact patch with the ground, that's the tyre and carcass. Some of that is coming from the wheel. Quite a lot is probably coming from the fork. Some could be coming from the steer, and obviously a little bit could be coming from the bars as well. It is complex, but there is flex in the system in this longitudinal under braking and with this rotational force as well. The logic of using a larger diameter stanchion or leg section is that as you increase the diameter, you increase stiffness. So the bigger fork will be stiffer, or should be. But there's other changes too, because as you increase the diameter, it means that, well, the crown's got to be a little bit bigger. And also, the lower leg has got to be a bit bigger. And of course, the innards, not always, but often will also have to increase in size. So in terms of difference in weight, well, there will be a difference. There's around 250 grams difference between the 34 and the 36. So the 36 is 250 grams heavier. Now, mass does matter. If you're climbing all day and you're really into cross-country and you're really into, I don't know, marginal gains and weighing your food, then 250 grams is not to be sniffed at. But if you're just riding, that 250 grams might not matter that much. as we're talking about suspension, we always need to touch on sprung mass versus unsprung mass. And well, the ratio between one and the other means that your suspension can work better. And with a fork like this, well, there is 250 grams of difference, which could make a difference. But where that mass is, well, the ratio is probably not going to change that much. Why? Well, because the sprung mass is going to be probably around the same, because we've got bigger crown, but then we've got bigger lowers. So I don't think there's that much difference with these two forks at least. Another mass that matters is the weight of the rider, and it's something that's often missed from reviews or details about the differences in these forks. And it's really important because, well, the mass of the fork is one thing, but the mass of the rider and the overall package is probably bigger. As an example, on a good day, I'm about 72 kgs. With a pack, well, let's say it's about 76, depending on what I'm carrying and how many snacks. So how I ride, and with my rider weight, will affect the suspension setup. It'll also affect how I can put force into the fork. Obviously, there's riders that are lighter than me, and there's riders that are heavier than me. And both of those riders are going to ride differently to me. So they're going to be able to attack and push the fork in different ways. So it's another thing to consider. Flex isn't good. Well, that's a really great maxim, and like many maxims, they're actually a lot subtler than that, and there's sort of not quite black and white, there's a greyer area. Okay, with early suspension forks, especially mountain biking, they were very noodly and they were lacking in stiffness. So from that perspective, yeah, more stiffness was a really good thing. Here's a great example of a very early fork. This is from around 96. This is a Rond WP. A slightly different version of this was used to win the first Olympic mountain bike race. I've ridden this and it is exceptionally noodly. Very hard to steer. It's very hard to brake with. I mean, even with rim brakes, which weren't that powerful, it was a very engaging ride, to put it politely. I mean, the other side then is that, well, we need much more stiffness. So yeah, we've got bolt throughs, that's helped. We've got much bigger lower legs. We've got much bigger crowns. We've now got taper steered instead of this straight through ensemble. So we've got lots more stiffness. So do we need even stiffer forks? That's where it gets subtler. Because if you've got a really, really stiff fork, then sometimes it can struggle to track, especially on off cambers. The whys and hows and wheres of why it's harder to track with an ultra stiff fork, well, it's beyond a small little video like this. But trust me, overly stiff forks can lose you little bits of traction, and they can give you more feedback than you might want. Why? Well, the contact patch which creates our grip isn't just a one-way street. We're not just steering the fork. Sometimes the fork is steering us too. So we've explored the different loads in a kind of static way of what happens to a fork. We've got different loads coming in and we've got different twisting loads. So there's quite a lot going on. And all of that is great to look at how much something flexes, but how does it ride? Well, we're going to try on a rock garden where we'll really push the limits of both the suspension travel and my last minute pinball riding style. We're also going to try on some sinewy single track to see the differences. And speaking of differences, well, quite clearly these are very different bikes. We've got different forks and they've also got different travel. The 34 has got 140mm of travel, whereas this 36 has got 160mm of travel. So it is all going to be different. It's not meant to be empirical though, just an experiment. Okay, that was fun. And I think the big take home immediately, especially having seen those old retro forks, is just how good modern suspension forks are. They work in lots of conditions. They absorb bumps really, really well, and they really change how you ride. Okay, the next thing is fairly obvious, that the 36, the burlier fork, does ride differently. Even though the tyre, the contact patch, is really similar, there's so many other factors in how that fork works and works with a bike. It does feel different. The more travel, the deeper travel you can feel. Okay, to the 34, it is still a staggeringly good fork, and it works really nicely, and it fits and gels with this bike really well. And I think that's where it all pulls together, is that, yeah, bolting a really stiff fork to a mega flexy or compliant frame might not work, and likewise fitting a more flexible fork or compliant fork to a bigger, stiffer bike might not work. It's about that complete package of making the fork work with the bike. And I say work because that is the final take home. If you're like me and brought up on one of those really noodly forks, then the newer school aggressive riding over the front, well, you just couldn't do that on the old forks because, well, you'd lose control very easily. There just wasn't the stiffness, there wasn't the support. But with either of these forks, you can. Yes, on rougher stuff, the bigger fork works, unsurprisingly, a little bit better, but it weighs a little bit more and it is a heavier bike. So it is all about the bike and how you ride and where you ride. So the pros of a 36, it is a burlier fork, it is stiffer, and you can feel that, especially in the single track and through those rock gardens when you're pinballing between stuff. It did help me pick those kind of gnarlier, slightly scarier lines because I was confident in the fork would be able to take it. Some of that comes from it's got a bit more travel. Some of that comes from the bike as well, so it's all inherent. And related to the fork being bigger and burlier, the bike is a little bit burlier as well, and that plays into the fact that it is more bike to move around. I'm not the heaviest rider around, so I notice that way a little bit more. If you're a lighter rider, then you might notice the extra mass. But if you're a burlier rider and you're riding burly stuff, then the bigger diameter forks, well, they make a difference. The 34 performed really well. It's a very nice fork. I think what I found interesting is that on the really burlier stuff where I was pushing myself, well, it did cope with it. It did work. Didn't fill me with huge amounts of confidence, but that's because it's a short travel fork. It's only got 140 mil of travel. So I think on this bike, it fits it really well, and it is lighter. You can feel the extra weight of the 36. So I think in this package, this bike works really well. And I think that kind of comes home. If I was a bigger rider, then actually bigger travel, stiffer fork would be nice. If I'm a lighter rider, well, this fork would work really well on really quite rough trails. But this is a shorter travel trail bike, and I think that hammers home the point. It is horses for courses. One isn't better than the other. They're designed to do different things, and, well, they function differently. Hopefully you found that interesting, and that 36 and 34, unsurprisingly, are very different forks. But what forks are you riding? And can you feel the difference? Or is it one of those nuanced things that you're not sure of? I think with back-to-back testing, you could, promise. If you've enjoyed this, then do give us the thumbs up. And if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel because it helps us keep making great content just like this. Cheers.